This is the 1959 Santiago International Tournament, a memorial tournament, Torneo de Arturo Alessandri Palma, held from April 20th to May 6th, right on the heels of the Mar del Plata tournament, and 8 of the players here at Santiago also played at Mar del Plata. That was a 15-player event, this a 13-player event. Bobby, not having his best event here, tied for 4th place with 7 wins, 4 losses, and a draw. But this event held from April 20th to May 6th, 1959 in Santiago, Chile. 13 grandmasters and masters from Europe, North America, and South America competed. Well, the tournament was fairly important for Fischer, who has only recently begun to compete in international events. Just did not fare so well in this particular event. And part of the reason, according to this, that Fischer and Pachmann, after the Mar del Plata event, kind of went on a tour through South America on their way to Santiago. And apparently, in this event, several rounds, Pachmann was playing Fischer's prep, and Fischer was playing Pachmann's prep. So, you know. And it's been a long, long trip, I think, for the 16-year-old Bobby Fischer. Well, you guys remember when you were that age, no discipline at all, I'm sure. And, you know, stay up till all hours. Who knows? I'm making excuses for him. Simply said, he did not play the best chess of his life in this event, but he played some pretty good chess. His opponent in this game, which, by the way, was played April 30th, 1959, his opponent was Julio Salas Romo, not to be confused with Tony Romo. This was another guy. Julio Salas, from the late 1930s to the early 1960s, was one of Chile's leading players. He was born February 18th, 1913, and he died in 1996 at the age of 83. In 1937, he won the Chilean Chess Championship for the first time with 6 out of 7. And then he won the title 3 more times in 54, 55, and 62. Julio Salas Romo. Starting the game with d4, Bobby answers with knight f6. c4 and g6 is the ever-familiar King's Indian defense, and knight c3, bishop g7, the normal variation. e4, d6, and f3, Samisch's variation. Friedrich Samisch lived from 1896 to 1975, a German chess player and theorist, and grandmaster, one of the first grandmasters on the official books. e5 played here by Bobby Fischer, and the king's knight comes to e2. Castles, this is your Bobotsov Korchnoi Petrosian variation, and by now you should know who Milko Bobotsov is. You hopefully already knew who Korchnoi and Petrosian were. Milko Bobotsov, the first Bulgarian to become a grandmaster, and that in 1961. The Bobotsov Korchnoi Petrosian variation. Bishop g5 played right here. c6, queen d2, queen's knight to d7, pawn d5, and knight to b6. That is not the most common line. More frequent is pawn takes the pawn. And after pawn takes the pawn, a6, keeping any intruders off of the b5 square. In this game, Bobby played knight b6 here, attacking this pawn, which subsequently attacks the queen, so his opponent defended with b3. And that's not really a good idea with a fianchettoed bishop aiming up here. So the better way to make the c-man safe is to move this knight out of the way and discover a defense. So knight to g3. And our c-man is safe and sound. b3 by Salas. Pawn takes d5. Knight takes d5. Don't take with the pawn here and occupy the weakness with a pawn. You want to occupy weak squares with pieces, not pawns. Okay, and now the bot tells me I'm wrong. You do want to take it with the pawn, but don't take it with the pawn. The bot does not know the principles of chess. All it knows are the numbers. Let me reiterate. You do not want to, unless you're forced to, occupy a weak square with a pawn. You want those weak squares occupied with pieces. But knight takes d5 it is, and knight b takes the knight. And now pawn takes the knight, and you end up with a pawn in the weak square anyway. You had no choice in that case, because you can't take with the queen. Well, maybe you could take with the queen, but it's dubious. Bishop d7 now, making way for the rook to arrive safely on the c8 square. Knight c3, a6, precluding any infiltration from either bishop or knight. So bishop d3, not having a good where to lay his head, he just gets out of the way of his king so he can castle. A weak square is a square that cannot be defended by a pawn. So coming back here, note that black has no more pawns that can come and control the d5 square, and therefore d5 is weak because his e-pawn has already passed that square and his c-pawn is just been relinquished in the capture. No other pawn can come to either of these squares. So that's what we mean by a weak square. b3, d take, knight takes, knight b takes, c takes. And the reason you want a piece there rather than a pawn if you're the attacker, the reason white would prefer a piece there is because the weak square is exposed on this half-open file, making it easier to attack this backward pawn. Okay, c takes d5, bishop d7, knight c3, a6, bishop d3. Here b5 was played, the bot calling for queen e8. I actually mentioned a moment ago when the bishop moved that I prefer to get my rook on the open file. Let's see what we get for that move. A star. But b5 from Fischer, it's a thematic move. b5 is. White does castle and queen to a5. Pinning the knight, soft pinning because the queen is defended. In fact, white says, my knight's not pinned, and plays knight to e2. The bot calling for bishop e3 to take control of this diagonal, which your king is on, and exposed to checks. And so the bot would rather play bishop e3, precluding any attacks along this line. Knight e2 was played, and as if to prove the bot's point, Bobby played queen b6 check. And the idea of queen b6 instead of trading queens is to play bishop h6, I think, right? Bishop e3. Yes, king h1 is the usual and safest way in positions like this to deal with a check on this diagonal. I would imagine queen to e3 should be fine as well, yes. Let's see what it says. We get a thumbs up. And unless you want to trade queens, you'll have to move yours to a safer place. Maybe queen b7, a thumbs up. If queen b7, certainly one of these rooks is going to come. I'd use my queen's rook personally, and I would get a check mark. All right, let's go back. In this game, Salas with bishop e3, hitting the queen. Surprising in my mind is queen b7 here. As I already mentioned, I was expecting bishop h6. Unless you want this kind of a trade, then you'll have to play f4. And if you play f4, I'll play queen d8. Otherwise, if white trades, if white takes the queen, bishop takes here, he'd probably have to chase me away. Let's go back. Instead, Bobby with queen b7 here, queen a5. And in case I didn't mention it, I'd rather personally, if I'm in white's shoes, get a rook to the open file. See what it thinks here. It gives me a check mark. Queen a5 is played, knight h5, which usually indicates that this F-man is going to march. Queen's rook to c1 at last. And really, the threat is rook c7, isn't it? Forking the queen and the bishop. So to prevent that, Bobby played his queen's rook to c8, taking his fair share of the open file, but the bot says to heed Oscar Pano's advice here. My probably most frequently quoted grandmaster. When you have two rooks, both of which can move to the same square, carefully calculate and consider which rook to play. And when you've made up your mind, move the other rook. Oh, yeah. Oscar Hano. And I guess the point is that you're still accomplishing the same task of vying for the open file, but you are affording your king or your bishop a place. But yeah, you might want to relocate your bishop in this direction. That's the only reason I could think of. I think the reason he used his queen's rook is because he's planning on pushing this pawn, and I think that because he moved the knight. So rooks belong behind mobile pawns as well as passed pawns. So queen's rook to c8, not liked by the bot. Queen b6 gets the big red X. Queen a3, a better move, hitting the undefended d-man. And I would imagine queen b4 accomplishes the same task, doesn't it? Should be just as good here. Let's see what the bot says. A check mark. But the point is, what are you going to do about this hit? But queen b6 was played, and queens are traded on b6. Now bishop h6 hits that rookie, and so he trades the rook off. Now I thought that rook c7 would be preferable, but this does get a star. The idea of rook c7 is to not only hit this bishop, but to threaten to get behind this backward pawn on a6. Now, you could try to get cute here, bishop e3, because the bishop on b6 is overworked. That would be cute. See what we get, right? The bishop can't take because he's busy guarding the rook, so he'd have to play king h1. All right, apart from the cuteness, I'm not sure what benefit it's really going to have. Okay, I take, he takes, and he's behind a pawn. Just take his rook, I think, is safest. Yeah. Okay, let's go back. White played rook takes the rook on c8, and rook takes rook gives Bobby the full share of the open file. You could contest it because the knight covers, but that would put the knight in a real... Oh, no, the bishop covers. Nope, you can't contest it. My bishop is there. I forgot that I played bishop h6, which is what provoked his rook to move to begin with. All right, rook d1 is played right here. g4 being called for. We are approaching the endgame quickly, so you may want to start getting your king into the game. Let's see what it thinks. A thumbs up. Instead, rook d1. Pawn f5. We were looking for that move. King f2 now. Pawn takes the pawn on e4. Bishop takes the pawn. Now knight f6, returning to its proper place and putting pressure on that bishop, which retreats to b1. Now knight g3 is the move that was recommended. This also comes with the added benefit of eyeing f5, so bishop f5 cannot be played. It's kind of a dual-purpose move, knight g3 is. Instead, he played the bishop to b1, and bishop f5 anyway, isn't it? Bishop takes the bishop then, and pawn takes the bishop. Now knight g3 is played. A minute too late. Rook c2 gives check, and king retreats to g1. That gets an inaccuracy. Note that black has a dark squared bishop, so king f1 stays off the dark squares, and he's slightly more central, isn't he? So, a couple good reasons to play king f1. Instead, king g1 was played, and now pawn f4 hits that knight. And I do not know why that gets a question mark. I don't see a better way to answer the threat that was coming against your pawn than to move it to safety and threaten the guy that was threatening you. Turn the table, you might say. I guess the point is that the pawn is now blocking our bishop, isn't it? And with these other pawns on dark squares, our bishop starts to look like a tall pawn, doesn't he? So the bot's saying, hey, get that bishop up here. My question is, if I play my bishop there, what's to stop knight takes the pawn? I don't understand. I guess because I've got some pawns that I can pick off. Is that what it is? I can play knight takes d5, or I can play rook takes a2. Maybe that's what the bot is saying. All right, f4. I would have played that move, and I'm not even as good as Bobby Fischer. All right, knight f5 was played. Hits my bishop, which comes to f8, defending my pawn. a4 here gets the inaccuracy. Fischer says, knight takes d5 is with tempo on b6. Hold on, let me go back. He's saying, play this because it hits the bishop. Oh, excuse me, I forgot to put the other move in. Play this, and then play this because it hits the bishop. Oh, yeah, I didn't even see that bishop hiding in the midst of my pawns. You're right. what you do is you attack the pinned piece if you're white. So if bishop takes bishop, rook takes the knight. Obvious. Good eyes by Fischer Seb. All right, f4 was played. Nothing wrong with that move. Knight forks the bishop and the pawn. Bishop moves to safety and defends the pawn. a4, not liked. I had my eye on perhaps g3 here, and it gets a thumbs up. Rook b2 was played. Oh, what did I do? I skipped a move. Oh, a4. Rook b3, getting behind the weakling. Apparently, rook c3 hitting the weakling is a better way because you're still maintaining a presence on the open file while pressuring that pawn. You may also, like I said before regarding white, want to start centralizing your king. It gets a star. And I mean, okay, if he trades, we trade. Okay, rook b2 was played. Bishop d8. Hits the knight, king f7 now, and that defends. A takes, and here g4. Getting a question mark. I personally thought, why not just defend the b-man? Let's see what we get, a thumbs up. And I was just about to say, or you could perhaps super attack this backward pawn. g4 was played. Pawn takes the pawn en passant, which cannot be bad in spite of the fact that the bot says it's inaccurate. It's not as though white can save the b-man, so why do I need to take it now? It'll be there in a minute. Okay, let's go ahead and look at this line. If rook takes the b-man, I mean, black is got a small advantage here. Let's presume he'll bring his king in, gets a check mark. I'm going to play b4. He'll take my knight, perhaps, because I just saw the arrow there a minute ago. Right. I mean, this looks pretty good for black, doesn't it? Bobby played en passant. Knight takes the pawn. Now rook takes the b-man. Apparently, bishop e7 is the better choice. And just trade off the bishops. Let's go back. Fickle bot, never happy. Here, bishop took the knight. King took the bishop. And we have rook bishop against rook knight. Black with an extra pawn, and it's a passed pawn. A passed pawn, by the way, if you're wondering, somebody was asking what constitutes a weak square. Ari's was. And we pointed out that a weak square is a square that cannot be attacked by one of the defender's pawns. Well, a passed pawn is a pawn that cannot be attacked by one of the defender's pawns or blockaded. So if there's no pawn on the adjacent files and no pawn on the same file, that's a passed pawn. If the f-man were gone, the e-man here would be a passed pawn. Right after king takes f6, rook to d2, gets a question mark. King to f2, worth a try to defend the f-man. Oh, that said king to g2. I said king to f2. I was thinking king to f2. The bot said king to g2, but then gave me a star. I prefer moving toward the center. I'm still defending the f-man, but I also have access to e3 should this rook ever abandon the third rank. Rook to d2, a little bit curious. I guess the point is he's hoping to decoy the rook so that he can come over after. Yeah, that's probably it. If you take, and Bobby didn't take, if you take, then I'm going to attack you. It gets a thumbs up to take. But then the point white is making is, I'm going to get this passed pawn. Yes, I gave you a new passed pawn, but your new passed pawn is closer to my king. So my king has better chances of helping to stop the e-man than it does of helping to stop the b-man. Let's go back. b4 was played by Fischer here. And by the way, king g6 being pointed to, the point of king g6 would be so that knight to e4 does not come with a check, I gather. Then we played king f2 just like before, and if bishop h6, then move the rook somewhere. All right, so b4 was played, king g2 was played. Okay, I talked about why f2 might be preferable a moment ago, but the reason g2 might be preferable is because black has a dark squared bishop, so put your king on a light square. Here, Fischer played king e7, getting an inaccuracy. You could hope for, well, if you push rook b1, you're playing to push the passer, and that's a mistake, apparently. But my point is I want to get my pawn rolling. The bots don't understand basic principles of chess. All they understand is raw numbers. And their understanding of those raw numbers make them so much better at chess than us, regardless of the principles. In other words, they don't care about the principles because they don't need them. We need principles. We need principles that tell us, activate your king in the endgame. Put your rook on the open file. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. Put your targets on opposite colored squares of his attackers. Things like that. Bots don't need those things because they can just calculate numbers fast enough to figure it out without principle. King f2 now being played. Right, knight to e4 would come with the purpose of just preventing the rook from sidestepping, at least from sidestepping to the c file. We could still sidestep to a3. King f2, however, now king d7, same comment. The whole point of sidestepping is to push that b-man. Now knight f5, wrong square. This does prevent the bishop from coming to the h6 square, but knight e4 is apparently the better choice. It puts an eye on the c5 square, for example, and that comes with check. So let's say bishop h6 here, rook c2, and then bishop e3 check. I put my king on e2, keeping it toward the center, and bishop c5. This is the illustration I'm giving. This is just to show why knight e4 is better than knight f5. In a position like this one, I can take this with check and pick up the pawn. All right, knight f5 prevents bishop h6, rook c3, rook a2, and that's going to come with the idea of rook a4 hitting the pawn or rook a8 hitting the bishop. Yeah, you could also play king e2 here. You want to get your king involved in this defense. Let's see what we get. A star. White's choices are limited. He doesn't have a whole lot of good moves. The eval bar is at 0.8, 0.9, which is not decisive. It's not even a moderate advantage. In Grandmaster terms, anything between 1 and -1 is going to be pretty much equal. In other words, even though the eval bar favors black, black still has quite a bit to prove at this juncture. But rook a2 here helps that eval bar to take a solid 1.1, 1.1. So we're now transitioning into the hazy realm of advantage for black. I just got done mentioning the principle of the passed pawn. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. And what would be good about b3 here is not only are you attacking this rook, but you're threatening rook c2, which forks the rook and the king. And the rook can't take the rook without allowing the pawn to promote. But Bobby played rook a3 and rook b2 and now b3 with the threat of forcing a trade. King e3 gets off the second, bishop e7. Salas tries to just trade here. Apparently king d3 is called for. This pawn stops this pawn, so you need to get your king over to help deal with this passed pawn, right? And you're coming to one of these squares. Knight takes the bishop, king takes the knight, and now king d3, and white says to the bot, it didn't matter which order I played this in. King f6, now king c3, king f5, uh-oh, another weakness to deal with. Rook g2, b2, discovers check, king takes the pawn, and rook takes the f-man, creating a new passer. h4 gets a thumbs up. I was thinking that rook g7 might be a chance to keep fighting, but the eval bar says, give you a star, but it's not going to really help. h4 was played. Now king e4, now rook g7. King takes the d-man, rook takes the h-man. His last hope is in this now newly created passed pawn. Rook h3, rooks belong behind passed pawns. Whether they are yours or your opponent's, rooks belong behind passed pawns. h5, king d4, h6, pawn d5, rook h8, pawn e4, h7, king e3. Whoa, that's searched. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, passed pawns are meant to be pushed here, so I'll go with e3 and get a star. King c2 is going to be answered by rook h2 check, and after king b3, and then I'm playing pawn e2, and what are you going to do, Mr. Magoo? What you going to do? You have to play rook e8. It's your only choice. And I don't even have to take your passer because your rook is overworked, isn't it? I can defend my pawn. Come back. Instead, Bobby went with king e3. There is no wrong way to win a chess game, says Bobby Fischer. Rook d8. By the way, king c3 will be answered by d4. Hopefully that's obvious. So, oops, didn't go back far enough. So, rook d8, rook takes h7, rook takes d5. Only one more pawn to stop, says Salas. But let's see Bobby's technique in building the bridge. Rook c7, rook d8, king e2, rook e8, pawn e3, and now we get rook f8, king e1, rook e8, pawn e2, rook f8. You know the technique, I'm sure. Rook c5. Get ready. Oops, sorry. Went one too far. Rook c5, rook f7, king d2. Ready to build that bridge. Rook d7 check, king e3, rook e7 check, king d3, rook e8, rook c4 now, and that's where he resigned. The gap has been bridged successfully, and so resignation was tendered. If you play rook d8, I can now interpose. Obviously, rook takes is answered by king takes, and your king is too far away to stop my pawn. If you come back behind, then I just move up one square, defending the promotion square. You're forced to give up your rook for my pawn, and I win with a rook and a king. Okay, good technique there in the end. Let's give you the numbers. 91.9 accuracy for Bobby Fischer. Single game rating 2,700. Really strong. He got the better of his opponent. It was a balanced opening, and they both did pretty good in the middle game, but the end game made the difference, and Bobby emerged victorious, showing us textbook technique.